What's up, my comic comrades? Today we continue our series around characters appearing in the Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings movie with the comic book history of the Mandarin, one of the most loved Marvel villains who it seems will finally be getting some much-deserved redemption in the MCU. Now, I've been staying away from as much info and news about the movie as I can besides watching the 2 trailers for it, but from what I've gathered, it seems that Shang-Chi's father is the Mandarin who is in possession of the Ten Rings, and the two come into conflict with one another, which is very similar to Shang-Chi's comic book origin. They just made Shang-Chi's dad the Mandarin instead of Fu Manchu, and are seemingly tying Shang-Chi very close to the Ten Rings, which is also very different from the comics. But with the movie dropping today, we're gonna find out soon. But before we dive in, we wanna thank Noom for sponsoring today's episode.
So there are primarily 2 things responsible for the robust slab of man meat you see before you: chicken wings and a crazy sweet tooth. But I know I'm definitely not alone when I say that the realities around the pandemic we've been dealing with over the past year and a half has really made me rethink my habits and get serious about my overall health. And that is how I first discovered Noom. I don't know about you, but I have never liked the fad diets, and having dealt with weight issues my entire life, I knew that I needed something that was going to help me address my habits in a fundamental and lasting way, which is why the Noom program stood out so much, because it's a very different way to shed pounds and get healthy using psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy practices. In other words, Noom helps you learn how your mind works so you can address the real reasons behind your eating habits and why we make the food choices we do. For me, I stay incredibly busy most of the time, and stress plays a big role in most of my eating habits. So using the Noom program to address those root causes has already been hugely impactful, especially as I've combined it with Noom's daily meal tracker and food database. By simply adding my meals and using Noom's color-coded food breakdown system, it's helped me to start identifying where my biggest problem areas are and start creating a sustainable path to correct them. So the Noom program combines its focus on the psychology of healthy habits with innovative technology, incredibly helpful tools, and supportive personal coaches. And if you go to noom.com/variant or click the link in the description, you can take Noom's free 30-second quiz to see what I'm talking about for yourself. There are many more positive things I could say about the Noom program, but I think the most positive thing I can tell you is that it works. I started the program 2 weeks ago and I'm already down 11 pounds on my way to my target weight of 220. And in this guy's opinion, Noom is an improved and more effective approach to creating real, lasting change when it comes to the habits that impact our waistline. So if you're like me and you want to live a healthier life, I highly recommend you go to noom.com/variant or click our link in the description below to take the free 30-second quiz and get started right now. You'll be glad you did.
Now with that covered, let's jump into the history of the Mandarin. Mandarin first appeared in Tales of Suspense issue 50 in February of 1964. He was created by Stan Lee and Don Heck. The Mandarin, I would say, is easily Iron Man's greatest villain, the Green Goblin to his Spider-Man, if you will. Which is why it was such a darn shame we never got to see Robert Downey Jr. Iron Man go up against the real Mandarin in the MCU. One of my few complaints of Downey's tenure as Iron Man was that he wasn't pitted against a proper version of his greatest enemy, the Mandarin. Such a missed opportunity. Anyway, what makes the Mandarin such a good villain is he's super complex with a good backstory. He's also a megalomaniac. The dude has always been trying to take over the world with his 10 rings. But in doing so, he possesses a sense of honor. It's almost like Ra's al Ghul, where he has this weird twisted sense of honor even though he's doing bad things. Like many villains in comics, even though they have a main hero they hate, in this case for the Mandarin, that would be Iron Man, we also see him come into conflict with a ton of other Marvel heroes like the Hulk, Thor, and the rest of the Avengers. But now you may be asking yourself, that sounds pretty cool, but where did this genius scientist and extremely skilled martial artist start? What is his origin? Well, it's funny you ask because his origin segment starts right now. Mandarin has had many different takes on his origin over the years, but we're going to be breaking down his classic one as it's the one I remember reading as a kid in the Marvel Masterworks collection. With that said, issue 62 of Tales of Suspense wastes no time getting into it. His origin is given to us within the first 6 pages. On the first page, we see that Mandarin has Iron Man bound and trapped. So the Mandarin, feeling pretty good about himself, tells Iron Man, you cannot escape the concentrated titanium bonds which hold you fast. So before you meet your fate, I shall tell you what no other human ears have ever heard. I shall tell you how I obtained my invincible power. While Iron Man tells himself the longer I can keep him talking, the more chance I have of finding a way to turn the tables on him. So it's at this point the Mandarin starts breaking down his origin, saying, my father was a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, but he married beneath him. He was foolish enough to marry a highborn English woman. The gods themselves must have been displeased, for when I was born, an idol fell upon my father, killing him instantly. While we see villagers say, tragedy has followed the birth of a child. It is an omen. It is an evil omen. Never has an idol toppled before. While my mother died of a broken heart upon hearing the news, and that the gods were appeased. But my family had been the wealthiest in China, and my father's sister hated me. Our treasures would have been hers if not for me. As we literally see her say, "Cursed child, if you have not lived, I would be the richest in all this land. But perhaps I may still be. If I were to take you to another village, none would ever find out. You would be brought up as a peasant." But as she grabs a blanket and is about to take him away, a chandelier almost falls on her head, crushing her, with her saying another omen: "I must never again harm this child. And whatever his destiny may be, mine shall be likewise. I shall never leave his side. I shall teach him to hate the world as I hate it, for I have been cheated of my fortune, of love, of everything I've ever desired." Mandarin goes on to tell Iron Man, "So I grew. Every bit of my childhood was spent teaching me the sciences of the world, the arts of warfare, and the subtle crafts of villainy. But then one day my wealth was gone, as we see officers coming into his palace saying they belong to the government, for you have not paid your taxes." And with that he left, and the very next day his aunt died. But the Mandarin tells us he didn't even mourn her death, as he was trained not to. Even with my wealth gone, the Mandarin says, "I still walked proud, for I was the Mandarin. The blood of the Khans flowed in my veins. The world would one day be mine." He then walks by people working saying, "If you would eat, you must work as we do." As another person says, "Fool, that's the Mandarin. He would rather starve." The Mandarin then tells us, "But I knew I would never starve, for I had a destiny. The gods had plans for me. I must wait for their sign." And that sign was not long coming. The Valley of Spirits. I heard whispers of such a place since childhood. It was a forbidden area where no man dare tread. But the Mandarin decided he was going to make his way there and check it out, saying, "To the one with the blood of the Khans in his veins, there is no such emotion as fear." So he descended into the awesome valley, and the gods guided his footsteps. As he's making his way there, he sees the remains of some long dead creature, a gigantic dragon. After this, he lost his footing and then plunged headlong into the valley below. Luckily for him, he landed on top of dense foliage, and when he sat up, he said, hidden from sight by the dense underbrush, a glistening metal ship, like something never before seen on this planet. It has been lying here all these centuries, waiting to be discovered by the Mandarin. Then upon entering the unearthly shell, Mandarin says, "I knew beyond any doubt that it could be only one thing, a vehicle of some sort, a spaceship that travels between planets." Once inside the spaceship, Mandarin tells us, "Time lost all meaning to me. I remained within the chamber until I had probed its every secret." Putting on a helmet to hear thoughts, it seemed to be some sort of mental impulse log, a record of the one who flew the ship ages ago. As we see panels of the Mandarin listening to the logs of SHANG-CHI, who had the ship before him, as the Mandarin says, that was the origin of the dragon legend in China. There was such a creature once, but no one knew he was an intelligent being from the distant stars. Mandarin then tells us, "After this I found the source of the ship's power, a power such as Earth has never seen, with 10 small rings or gems which contained unlimited energy. I took the rings from the slowly rotting craft, knowing that they could make me the most powerful man in all the world, saying those 10 rings holding enough energy to drive the huge ship between galaxies will make me the master of Earth." The Mandarin then spent weeks, months, and years outfitting a deserted castle he found, which stood within the Valley of Spirits. Every treasure of the spaceship soon found a place within the great stone walls. Mandarin then tells us he studied the alien science of the ones called SHANG-CHI until I mastered it. And then I put the uncanny knowledge to use. At this point, he finally understood each of the 10 rings, saying each of them has a separate power. I shall wear them on my fingers. He then tells us, "Again it stormed on the night I donned the rings, just as it stormed on the night of my birth. Another omen. I cannot fail." Using my irresistible rings, it was but the work of minutes to completely subjugate entire villages to my will, telling them you will obey my every whim, with them responding, "All hail the Mandarin, the master has spoken, mightiest of the mighty is the Mandarin." As we're brought back to the present, where the Mandarin is explaining all this to Iron Man. And that, my friends, is how the Mandarin became the Mandarin. So now let's move on to story arcs and publication history. Now, like I said earlier, the Mandarin's origin has been retold and redone several different times throughout his comic history. For instance, in the story arc Iron Man Enter the Mandarin, we are retold how Iron Man's greatest enemy came to be. It's one of those origins that doesn't necessarily redo or reinvent anything as much as it does add more story and depth to the original classic origin. We even see the very first meeting between Iron Man and the Mandarin and learn what went down during this first encounter. So if you're a fan of the Mandarin's original origin like me, because that's what you grew up with and remember reading as a kid, this story will only expand that with a few changes here and there. Essentially, if you want a nice modern retelling of the Mandarin, this would be my personal go-to or recommendation for anyone, as it's only 6 issues and a nice easy read. Next, we have Iron Man War Machine Hands of the Mandarin. Now, besides the classic Mandarin stuff from the Masterwork volumes that I used to read at Barnes & Nobles, this is the Mandarin I remember growing up with, as these were the current comics coming out in the 90s. In the story, the Mandarin has both of his hands replaced after previously losing both of them. For those of you wondering, his hands were previously vaporized because of Iron Man combining his power with the rings, with the ensuing blast vaporizing the Mandarin's hands. But don't worry, over time we find out in the story that they grew back, but for some reason as reptilian claws, at which point the rings call him again to reclaim them. I thought and still think his reptile hands look cool and very reminiscent of the 90s Iron Man cartoon. Anyway, after getting these new reptile hands, the Mandarin has found an all-powerful artifact called the Heart of Darkness, which seems to be giving him new abilities. But of course, Iron Man just can't let the Mandarin dominate the world, but the problem is, his buddy and partner in crime, War Machine aka James Rhodes, quit working for Tony, and the two aren't on the best of terms. Needless to say, this makes for some good compelling story, and we also get to see Iron Man and his Force Works team, which is consisted of old West Coast Avengers, try to take down the Mandarin. This is just one of those stories I look at, and the art immediately brings me back to my childhood because I have vivid memories of it. It's so good. Anyway, from here we have Iron Man Revenge of the Mandarin. The story deals with Iron Man nearly being beaten to death, at which point he returns to take on the Mandarin, who's preparing to attack Russia from his flying fortress, because every villain has to have a flying fortress. I mean, it's like in Villainy 101. If that doesn't sound intriguing enough, maybe this will jog a memory from my fellow 90s kids. In the story, we see Tony Stark has customized a Plymouth Prowler to fly. Come on, who remembers the Plymouth Prowler? It was like the future roadster at the time. It came out a little bit after the Dodge Viper. Another good Mandarin story is Demon, which is found in the Invincible Iron Man Volume 9, titled Demon. It's a 5-issue series that deals with the consequences of the Feared Self event. He's been hounded and attacked by the media, all the while the Mandarin is planning an attack on America. The story leads directly into the Long Way Down story arc from the same series. In this story, we continue to see Tony Stark spiraling out of control, as he quote-unquote has a deadly chess match of sorts against the Mandarin. It's one of the best Mandarin stories in recent years, definitely one of the most popular. I mean, if you Google Mandarin stories, this is like one of the first that's gonna come up. And that's probably because it easily shows us why the Mandarin is Iron Man's greatest villain. And of course, I couldn't forget to at least mention the Extremis virus, where we see the Mandarin try to release the Extremis virus as part of his plan to reshape the entire human race. This story is what Iron Man 3 was loosely based off of, and what the movie should have been. There's a bunch more great Mandarin stories like Iron Man Haunted and so on and so forth, but I think you guys get the point. So now let's move on to powers and abilities. Like mentioned in this episode, the Mandarin is a scientific genius, and he also possesses extraordinary martial arts skills, especially with his ability of channeling Qi into physical power. Being able to channel his Qi, he's capable of sustaining himself for literally years without water or food. But it also amps up his strength enough to engage in hand-to-hand combat with Iron Man, who is obviously powered by the most advanced armor in the world. By focusing his Qi, he's been able to damage Iron Man's armor. But as impressive as that is, Mandarin's main power comes from his 10 rings. Now last year we did an episode explaining and breaking down each of the 10 rings, telling you how they work and what they do. So if you want an in-depth episode on how the 10 rings work, click the link right here. With that said, I'll give you a really brief breakdown right here before you go watch our in-depth episode on the 10 rings. And you'll notice some of the ring names are self-explanatory. Let's start with his left hand. On his pinky finger, you have the Ice Blast ring. Then on his ring finger, you have the Mento Intensifier, a ring which allows the Mandarin to mentally dominate one or more people. On his middle finger, he has the Electro Blast ring. On his index finger, the Flame ring. And then on his thumb, he has the White Light ring, which releases any energy which is found along the electromagnetic spectrum. As for his right hand, on his pinky, he has the Black Light ring, which can create an area of darkness that absorbs all available light within the area. On the ring finger, he has the Degeneration beam, which releases a beam of energy that destroys the molecules of any object it touches. Then on his middle finger, he has the Vortex beam ring. On his index finger, the Impact ring, which releases a destructive energy blast. And then on his thumb, the Matter Rearranger ring, which is able to rearrange, speed up, or slow down the molecules of an object. Now I'm assuming none of the rings are going to be like that in the movie, as they're not even rings that you wear on your fingers in the MCU, but rather on your forearms. Although I will say they look pretty freaking cool, so we'll just have to wait and see the movie to see how the rings work in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But with that said, let's move on to Mandarin reading recommendations. Check out Tales of Suspense issue 50 and 62, Iron Man Enter the Mandarin, Iron Man War Machine Hands of the Mandarin, Iron Man Revenge of the Mandarin, Invincible Iron Man Volume 9 Demon, and Iron Man Volume 10 Long Way Down. That should be enough to get you all started. And that's going to bring today's episode to a close, but if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to check out this one right here. And if you like all the content, be sure to subscribe, like, and comment. It always helps the channel out. But other than that, I'll see you guys next time when I talk about all things comics.